Hello and welcome to the Vaults of Terra. My name is Ed and today we're going to be continuing with our Horus Heresy series with a quick look at the Battle of Prospero. This was also known as the Burning of Prospero and was a battle prior to the beginning of the Horus Heresy, although it occurred in relative tandem to the Battle of Istvan III. It was a massive battle and set the tone for many of the later conflicts during the Heresy. It involved Primarch Leman Russ and the Space Wolves Legion against Primarch Magnus the Red and the Thousand Suns Legion. Prior to this battle at the Council of Nicaea, the Emperor had concluded that he needed to enact a widespread ban against psychic powers, which included banning the usage of psychic powers by the Space Marine legions. Magnus, who himself was a psyker, as were many of his legionaries, objected strongly to this ban, but he was denied. Dejected, Magnus returned his legion to their homeworld of Prospero to muse on this ban and try to overcome it so he could continue exploring the depths of both his and his marines' psychic powers. He also, during the council, received a vision of Horus potentially rebelling against the Imperium, a prophecy that Magnus thought he could overcome. He first attempted to guard Horus's mind remotely, protecting him from malicious psychic attacks. However, after Horus was wounded on Davin, Magnus was unable to prevent the influence of the Chaos Gods from taking hold. Once Horus had been corrupted, Magnus tried to contact the Emperor himself, using powerful psychic communication to let the Emperor know of the coming treachery and display his mastery of his psychic abilities to his father. However, the immensity of the power he used unwittingly destroyed part of the construct the Emperor was making within the warp around Terra, related to the Elder transport conduits known as the Webway, although some accounts hold it was Chaos Assistance that allowed Magnus to break through the Webway conduit. This human webway led directly back to the Emperor's palace and to his laboratories on Terra, and the destruction of a portion of it allowed the demons and abominations to pour through from the warp into this small webway, forcing the Emperor to seal the webway with his own power through the Golden Throne. However, at the moment the webway was broken, the astral form of Magnus appeared within the gateway on Terra in the Imperial dungeons in front of his father, and he realised the magnitude of his error. Thousands were dead, and the Emperor knew it was he who caused the devastation. He and the Emperor regarded one another for a moment, then Magnus's mind forced him to flee back through the warp to Prospero, horrified by his error and the Emperor's potential response to it. Back on Prospero, Magnus realised the warp powers had manipulated him, and that in order to overcome this mistake and regain the Emperor's trust, he would personally have to take responsibility and accept the Emperor's punishment, which was already on its way in the form of Leman Russ and the Space Wolves. Magnus hid the facts of his error and the incoming Space Wolves fleet and kept it a secret from his legion to prevent them fighting back and worsening the situation. He blocked all psychic communication with his powers to Prospero and sent 4 battle fleets of his sons away with sealed orders from Prospero to distant parts of the galaxy to keep as many of his sons from harm as possible. Soon, hundreds of vessels had arrived in orbit, made primarily of the Space Wolves Legion along with members of the Adeptus Custodes and the Sisters of Silence. Originally, the fleet's orders were to return Magnus to Terra to answer for breaking the commandments of Nicaea. However, Horus intercepted these orders, and whilst not overruling the Emperor, he manipulated Russ into believing that it would be a waste of time to bring Magnus back to Terra, implying that it'd be better that Russ, who had never been a fan of Magnus himself, kill his psyker brother and his legion on Prospero. The lore also hints that this would not be the first time Russ had made war on another Space Marine legion on the Emperor's own orders, as it is believed that he may have purged the 2 unknown legions. This was designed by Horus to help deflect suspicion away from his own actions, which were the beginnings of the heresy in the Istvan system. Still, Russ did make overtures to communicate with his brother before the attack. Unfortunately, the one receiving Russ's communications was a Chaos agent and never passed the communications on to Magnus. Greeted by radio silence, Russ decided enough was enough and began his attack. As the Thousand Suns fleet was away from the planet, they had to rely on orbital batteries to defend the world. Unfortunately, these were destroyed in the opening moments by long-range torpedo strikes, and whilst some of the fleet intercepted civilian ships, the rest began firing on the planet, using massive melter torpedoes, mass driver weapons, and laser batteries to destroy the cities and the planet's crust itself. Mountains fell, seas boiled, and superheated winds scored the planet's surface as its geology was forever disrupted and destroyed by the bombardment. Only one city survived under a psychic kind shield formed by the remaining 1,000 suns around the city of Tzika. However, Magnus did not fight back himself. He believed this punishment was ordained by the Emperor, and he ordered his sons to cease their struggle, to die with honour and allow the Emperor's judgment to take place. Thousand Sons chief librarian Azek Ahriman realised what these orders meant, but decided to fight rather than lay down and die, convincing the remaining 1,000 Sons and their captains to ignore their Primarchs' orders and to fight back anyway. Tzika lacked any air defence, and so the Space Wolves' landing was almost unopposed, with their dropships landing waves of Space Wolves and blasting at the defences of the 1,000 Suns. Leman Russ himself was the first to set foot on the soil of Prospero, and led the attack against the 1,000 Suns and the Citizens' militia that had also formed. The Space Wolves were accompanied by heavy armour like Predators, Land Raiders and Whirlwinds, along with Land Speeders and other attack craft. With these weapons, the Space Wolves did not so much attack, but rather began the demolition of Tzika. However, the 1,000 Suns began assembling their forces around the drop zone as soon as possible, and began their counterattack in earnest. They lacked the numbers and the heavy armour of the Space Wolves, but they made up for it by the liberal use of their psychic powers, driving back the Space Wolves with sheer psychic might several times and inflicting heavy casualties on their one-time allies. The 1,000 Suns also had access to a long dormant titan known as Canis Vertex, which was able to hold a large section of the Space Wolves' advance with its immense and now warp-powered weaponry and defences, holding the line against the Space Wolf advance. The Adeptus Custodes also joined in the attack, using their powerful jet bikes to inflict hit-and-run raids, although their low numbers and lack of psychic defences meant that their casualties were actually quite high. The 1,000 Suns were able to hold the line whilst they evacuated their citizens to the safest part of the planet, the Pyramid of Photep, far from the current front line. However, it was at this stage that the Sisters of Silence joined the battle. Whilst the powerful Custodes had died like any other to the 1,000 Suns' powers, these psychic black soldiers were unaffected by the power levelled against them. Combined with an advance from the Wolves and the Custodes, the Suns were forced back, their one major advantage crippled by the anti-psychic Sisters. The Suns were able to halt this retreat temporarily by concentrating on the Sisters, using overwhelming force to cripple them before using their psychic powers to finish off the enemy around them. This counterattack drove a wedge into the attacking forces and looked ready to push them back. Unfortunately for the defenders, this is when the Space Wolves Primarch reached the front line. With a terrifying roar, Leman Russ charged into the thick of the fighting. Despite the 1,000 Suns' powers, they were still slaughtered by the score, falling before the unstoppable might of the enraged and battle-hungry Primarch. The 1,000 Suns convinced themselves that killing Leman Russ then and there with their powers would end the battle. However, a direct psychic blast, whilst staggering Russ, somehow was reflected back at the 1,000 Sun who used it, incinerating his soul itself and setting him aflame with warp fire. The former Marine's screaming form was given a wide berth by the 1,000 Suns, who realised killing Russ would take more than they could achieve with just psychic powers. Another 1,000 Suns captain named Takar decided on a new plan, drawing in all the warp power he could to his own body. Massively augmented by the warp, and stronger than he ever had been, he then charged Russ, overpowering all before him. However, the Emperor's own bodyguard, a Custodes named Constantin Valdor, stepped between Takar and Russ, naming Takar a monster. At that moment, the 1,000 Sun realised Valdor was correct. His body had become hideously mutated by warp energy, and he no longer resembled the proud Marine of the 1,000 Suns Legion, but a warp monstrosity. That moment's hesitation was all Valdor needed to cut the former Marine down in one blow. As the Space Wolves again advanced, they were putting the great libraries of Prospero to torch, and using the people they located there, they were able to find Ahriman, who was commanding the Suns' forces whilst Magnus refused to fight. All over, the Space Wolves advanced, and the 1,000 Suns responded by drawing more and more deeply on their psychic powers. This was when some learnt the high price of these powers, with many of them becoming overwhelmed by them, self-destructing or becoming hideous abominations. One such self-destruction was so powerful it was the equivalent of a starship warp core explosion, incinerating a section of the city and lighting the sky with warp fire. The backwash of this explosion badly damaged the 1,000 Suns Titan, fusing it in place and causing it to topple, as the miniature sun caused by their self-destruction obliterated an area of the city. The feedback of this explosion caused other 1,000 Suns psychically linked to the Titan to also explode, and this massive swath of destruction through their own lines collapsed the 1,000 Suns' defences. Ahriman reluctantly gave the orders to fall back, gathering them all in Oculum Square, the heart of their former defences. Ahriman realised upon seeing his forces that the Thousand Sons were greatly reduced, with only the oldest and most experienced marines surviving. Expecting to resist the next few assaults, however, his hopes were dashed when Ahriman spotted Leman Russ himself, leading 6,000 Space Wolves to assault their position directly. Ahriman duelled directly with an enemy rune priest who was helping bolster the Space Wolves' attack, and was able to defeat him, but was not able to hold back Russ or his wolves. Pulling back to the pyramid of Photep, the Suns had merely 1,500 marines left to hold off the wolves and protect the pyramid, crammed full of the city's last surviving civilians. Whilst a smaller space allowed the Suns to hold off the wolves for a time over a causeway that led into the pyramid, they were again overcome when the wolves unleashed the mutated and giant Wolfen, failed Space Wolf Marine aspirants turned bestial killing machines, used to inspire terror in the civilians and overcome the Suns with brutal muscle power. With this and their defences crumbling, the remaining Thousand Suns prepared to meet their death, until Magnus finally appeared, the pain of psychically feeling his son slaughtered, driving him out to fight. His explosive entrance to the fight annihilated a large chunk of the Wolfen forces and momentarily drove the Space Wolves back, with warp fire and lightning striking down whilst the very sky split asunder with the force of Magnus's unleashed powers, the warp bleeding into real space above Prospero. Vehicles exploded from his psychic lightning and the Space Wolves were impaled by huge shards of telekinetically thrown glass. Only Leman Russ stood his ground with his 2 giant wolves at his side, allowing his troops to retreat in the face of this enraged demigod, his own brother. As he advanced, Magnus used his powers to slow the passage of time momentarily, giving Ahriman his last orders to retreat inside and take the Book of Magnus, the Primarchs' collective teachings, and protect it should Magnus fall. With this complete, Magnus returned time to its normal flow and began the fight, his psychic might against Russ's hyperhuman strength. Magnus used his psychic powers to ensure this was a one-on-one duel and blocked the causeway with his psychic powers. Russ seemed immune to direct psychic attacks and was able to strike Magnus with multiple blows. Using Bale Fire to create a gap, Magnus used his own physical weapons to fight his brother, including his fists. Many of the bystanders watched in awe as these 2 titans fought, blocking access to the pyramid. Some tried to get around this fight and attack through a moat that surrounded the pyramid. With a gesture, Magnus turned this moat to acid, and those trying to cross burned as they died. As they fought, the breach in the sky became more pronounced, the warp rolling into sight and causing terror amongst many who could see it, with the sky weeping oily tears at the fight between these 2 brothers. As the fight progressed, both Primarchs injured the other horribly. Magnus's psychically augmented punch broke Russ's breastplate and sent the shattered pieces into his torso. Russ broke that same arm used to deliver the punch with a mighty blow. Magnus then stabbed and transfixed Russ with a blade made of pure force from the palm of his hand, and Russ's giant wolf companions tore into Magnus's legs, preventing him from striking again at their master. Magnus killed the wolves and turned back to his brother. Both were badly injured, and even their advanced healing powers were having trouble keeping both Primarchs alive. The brothers then discarded their weapons, beginning to wrestle, each trying to throttle the other to death. They fell from the causeway on which they fought, and Magnus now could not stop the wolves charging into the pyramid to finish off his sons and the civilians. In an effort to stop the advance, Magnus used a massive psychic attack to strike Russ, but in response Russ's blade swung up instinctively, slicing through Magnus's one remaining good eye. Magnus reeled in his blindness, and his body struggled to heal both his arm and his eye. With this, Russ seized his blinded brother, lifting him above his head and breaking his back across Russ's armoured knee. The break echoed like a gunshot across the now silent square, and there was silence from both sides in this aftermath as neither could believe the result. As Magnus lay paralysed, he had to psychically link his mind with Ahriman, using the last of his power from the Primarch and the Librarian's own power to activate Magnus's last failsafe spell, just as Russ made to strike the killing blow on his crippled brother. With a wash of psychic energy, Magnus and all his sons were teleported deep into the warp, abandoning their home and its people to their fate. The wolves had won the Battle of Prospero, but the sons had escaped their ultimate fate, badly damaged but alive. The wolves slew the remaining Prosperan people as per their orders and scoured the planet's surface, with only a few underground structures surviving the burning of Prospero. In the end, only 1,242 sons survived from Prospero, teleporting to a world known as the Planet of Sorcerers, locked deep in the warp. There, Magnus transcended his broken body, becoming pure warp energy and a servant of Tzeentch, the Chaos God of Change. That's all I have to say on the Battle of Prospero. It was a devastating conflict that involved both sides. A fun lore fact, the cross sum of 1,242 with each individual digit of the number added together equals 9, which happens to be the holy number of Tzeentch, and you have to wonder if it was ever planned to end this way. So that's everything I have to say today. Thank you for listening. The next session of Vaults of Terra Dark Heresy will be on the 17th of October, so I look forward to seeing those who want to watch there. If you have any other requests or comments, you can leave them in the comment section below or send me a personal message. In any case, I hope you've enjoyed listening today. See you next time on the Vaults of Terra.